Picking just 19 Beach Boys favorites is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. If you asked me tomorrow, I would probably want to include Kiss Me Baby, Salt Lake City, Girl Don't Tell Me, Little Girl I Once Knew, At My Window, and from Holland, Funky Pretty and Mount Vernon and Fairway. Blondie Chaplin's vocal on the fade out of Funky Pretty is sensational. But here's my list as of today. Brian Wilson's 19 favorites on February 11th, 2002. It's not often that members of the Beach Boys actually sit down and compile lists of their favorite Beach Boys tunes. And that kind of makes sense. There's a lot to pick from. It probably depends on their mood at the time and so on. And they want to remember some fan favorites and maybe some oddities as well. And they might even love some of the unreleased songs. Mike Love once claiming Dennis Wilson's I've Got a Friend was one of his all-time favorite tunes. Well, guess what? We don't have a studio recording of that, so we kind of have to take his word for it. That being said, this makes today's album, Classic selected by Brian Wilson from 2002, a very interesting piece. As the liner notes, which I just read for you, indicate, they asked Brian to make a fairly short, but yet also in-depth, playlist of his Beach Boys favorites. I thought today we'd take a look at this and see what Brian picked, why he picked it, what's readily available, and the one exclusive track that is still only available on this CD. So Brian decides to start off at the beginning, and he makes a pretty simple choice with 1963's Surfer Girl. Brian saying he has to include this, as it was the first song he ever wrote. This uses the one from the Surfer Girl single and album. It doesn't use an earlier one, like something that was released on Becoming the Beach Boys, one of those takes that borrows more from the 50s and from the 60s. So we get the usual one there, followed by The Warmth of the Sun, which Brian talks about as a tribute to JFK after his assassination and so on. Warmth of the Sun didn't chart. It was the B-side to Dance, Dance, Dance. And I don't think it was in the live set until at least the later 60s, but you could tell that a fan kind of cult developed around it very early because it was on the original Best of the Beach Boys LP and so on. And it's definitely a song that Brian loved because he would come back and revisit that amongst others much later as a solo artist. After this we have a complete single, songs 3 and 4, I Get Around. Brian mentions that he includes it as it was the first chart topper the Beach Boys ever did, and its B-side Don't Worry Baby follows it, Brian noting the influence from Phil Spector and his song Be My Baby and the Ronettes and all that. Very interesting, a complete single. Most of the songs on here are ballads, Brian definitely favoring kind of the slower, more emotional songs over the rockers. So it's going to be a few rockers still, like I Get Around. This is the beat-up one I hang on my wall. That's why it's not in the sleeve. After that we go back in time for In My Room, even though chronologically it would come before I Get Around and Don't Worry Baby. It makes sense kind of put it here. They probably didn't want to put it right after Surfer Girl. And he talks about how when he and his brothers would sing as children in their bedroom, In My Room reminds him of that. After that we get California Girls, another rocker, Brian calling it the Beach Boys Anthem. Indeed, for many years, California Girls was the opening song in many of their concerts. After this we take a short detour into Pet Sounds territory. We get God Only Knows, of course, Sirius XM's pick for Best Beach Boys Song when they polled fans, that kind of thing, so it makes sense that it's definitely here. And we also get a song that you could argue as a Brian solo. We get Caroline No, closer to the Pet Sounds album, but also one that he frequently revisited as a solo artist. Caroline No, of course, when Brian wasn't touring with the group, would be sung by other people. You can find a great live version on the 1973 in-concert album. We'll talk about all that stuff another day. It's nice that it's here though. Caroline No, sometimes often overlooked, but makes for a great album closer. Following that we get into Smile territory with Good Vibrations, Wonderful, Heroes and Villains, and Surf's Up. Now Brian of course was probably in the early stages of planning his solo take on Smile. And this was before the Smile sessions or anything like that was released. So the only Beach Boys Smile recordings were had or that were available, I should say, were kind of odds and ends on the Smiley Smile Wild Honey CD, the stuff on the 1993 box set, and so on. But you can tell Brian definitely still loved a lot of his Smile work, even though the original project didn't pan out. So we have Good Vibrations, which Brian doesn't write much about in the liner notes, just saying it's a pocket symphony, it was a production achievement, that kind of thing. Wonderful, Brian describes as a happy song. Doesn't say much about that one either. It's good to see Wonderful here, though, because that's one that often gets skipped over. Heroes and Villains. And then Surf's Up. Interestingly, with Surf's Up, we don't get like a 1960s take. We get the one from the 1971 record. But this is pretty common practice with Smile tracks. For example, the 1993 box set even said, hey, this take of Cabanescence is from later, but we're putting it with the Smile material because it technically fits. And I'm okay with that. As long as they're up front and say, hey, some of these are official mid-60s Smile recordings and some of them aren't, then I think it's a fair game. And Surf's Up fits really well here, despite being from much later than the songs that surround it. We have Busy Doing Nothing from Friends. So kind of interesting to get this one here. It's the only song from Friends on this CD as well. So that's kind of neat. And Busy Doing Nothing, of course, very quirky Brian tune. You know, he says how it's kind of personal, that kind of thing. And it is. And supposedly, if you knew where to begin, if you follow the directions in the story, you'll end up at his house. So there you go. Or at least his house in 1968. But that's kind of a fun one, and definitely stands out as one of the quirkier tunes there. We get We're Together Again. This could have been a rarity for quite a few Beach Boys collectors. Brian writes in the liner notes how much he loves the song We're Together Again, but yet it never really did anything for the Beach Boys. It was never on an LP, nor was it released as a single. Brian writes the first time it was widely available on the Friends in 2022 for a CD. I have a whole video on every bonus track on the twofers, so we talk more about it here. I love We're Together Again. It's such a great song, and I'm kind of surprised they didn't really do anything with it. Now, it's popped up in other places since, like the Made in California box set, which we'll get to in a moment, but nice to have it here. And again, something that's a little rarer that could have maybe enticed a more casual fan or someone just starting their collection into purchasing this. So I'm glad it's here. Following We're Together Again, we have Time to Get Alone, a song with a very complicated production and release history. It was attempted multiple times during Wild Honey, during Friends, so it was eventually released on 2020. Lots of different versions available. This uses kind of the standard album version. Great song, complicated release history, and another one you can find in quite a few different places. It's re-released, kind of periodically there. We get This Whole World from Sunflower, the only thing from Sunflower, surprisingly. And that's a good choice. We know Brian loves that song. He's done it live many times, and it's yet another one of those Beach Boys tunes that he has tinkered with as a solo artist. It was not commercially successful, but today it's one of the best love tracks on Sunflower, which is saying something, because that's one of their best loved albums. Following that, we have Marcella from Carl and the Passions. Brian writes that it was a tribute to the Rolling Stones. In much the same way, Girl Don't Tell Me is often described as Brian's attempt to write a Beatles song. Apparently this was his attempt to write a song for the Rolling Stones. Marcella, as we've talked about before, kind of went through various stages as different songs, like All Dressed Up for School, and I Just Got My Pay, before eventually becoming Marcella. Good to have it here, though, and I like that we get some 70s stuff to kind of mix it up a little bit. We're not stuck entirely in the 1960s. Followed by Sail On Sailor from Holland. So we know from that intro that Brian wrote and I read for you that Brian mentions a few songs on Holland. Of course, when we think of Holland, we usually think of Sail On Sailor, and Brian includes it here. He does note that it was more or less inspired by Van Dyke Parks, and a lot of different people collaborated and wrote different lyrics, and it probably ended up as a much different recording than anticipated. Steve Lewis of the Beach Boys Basement talks about the version recorded by KGB, which had completely different lyrics and a different tone and everything else. We have a songwriting demo session that was released in the Sail On Sailor box set. And ultimately, I found a clip from an interview saying that Brian Wilson didn't like Sail On Sailor, that kind of thing. And I don't know. At the end of the day, as probably one of their most popular 1970s tunes, I get why it would be here, but Even in the liner notes, it seems like Brian's a little bit confused by the whole thing. Maybe he felt this song wasn't entirely his vision, but it was still a good song. I don't know. Interesting stuff. And we peel back time a tiny bit, back to the Surf's Up album for Till I Die, which Brian talks about being a very sad song and also being one that was very emotional and just kind of speaks for itself, I think. And I'm glad they went out of their way to include Till I Die, as it's probably the Beach Boys' darkest song, but it's a very beautiful one, and it kind of serves as a good, at least start of the finale for this set. But it's not the finale, and we get to maybe the most interesting part of the album, a recording of California Feelin'. Brian notes that California Feelin' by the Beach Boys was never officially released. He says it was never officially recorded by them either, but we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But he said he had so much fun working on the song, he loved it so much that he took his touring band, got them in the studio, and they recorded their own version. And this is a really good version. It's probably my favorite one. It even has an extra verse that none of the Beach Boys ones I've found ever do. You're a river running through me, you hold me through the storm, that kind of thing. But California Feelin', good song that was an ode to California. Many Beach Boys fans, myself included, had never heard it before this release. But Made in California would find new life about a decade later, as it was one of the tracks that was used to heavily promote the 2013 Made in California box set. I have a whole video on Made in California, and we talk a lot about California Feelin' in that, because we actually get a couple versions here. We get both the Beach Boys' actual version and also an early demo. Sadly, we don't get the take with Rocky Pamplin singing lead, but I guess that's okay. But California Feelin' was really pushed as one of the songs to promote this box set. And there was a music video made for it and several other things. And apparently it resonated enough that it was remixed and used as the big finale to the Sounds of Summer 60th anniversary set there, which I also have a whole video on. So I like that. It still had some life in it. You know, they dug this song out of the vaults. Brian did it himself, then they released the Beach Boys stuff, and later remixed it here. But this is still my favorite version, and this particular track remains exclusive to this CD. Real quick, I'll show you the booklet here. You can see Brian wrote a blurb for every song, some longer, some shorter, depending on what he had to say, many of which I summarized for you. You get some nice picture collages on there. And all in all, it's a pretty nice little release. Not sure who the child on the front is, though. Don't think it's young Brian. So, classic selected by Brian Wilson. Very interesting curio, and if you love California Feelin', I can't recommend it enough. At the end of the day, it's not really a greatest hits package. It falls in more with other albums we've talked about, like Summer Love Songs and Covered by the Beach Boys, in that it's trying to pan to many different types of fans, casual ones and collectors and so on, having a little bit of everything. But everything being recommended by Brian Wilson, I think, really helps sell this one. It kind of gives you an idea of what Brian had planned for the Beach Boys. It's original, it's a very rewarding listen, and it's got some beautiful songs on it. What are some of your favorite Beach Boys tunes? Or what do you think are some that Brian should have included here but didn't? Lastly, of course, we're very sad to learn of the passing of Brian's wife, Melinda. She will be greatly missed. And I hope Brian is doing well. And maybe we'll have a new solo album or something from him in the next few years. I'm sure it'll be something very introspective and very wonderful. Thank you for watching our video today, and we'll see you next time. So long.